Men in Black, Section 1, Gentle Opening and Introduction. Welcome back to Sleepy Side Stories, where we wander through the strange corners of history and folklore, letting the mysteries of the world gently carry us toward rest. Tonight we're going to talk about visitors. Not the kind you invite in for tea, but the kind who arrive unannounced, who stand a little too still in doorways, who ask questions that don't quite make sense. We're going to talk about the Men in Black. Before we begin, if you enjoy these late-night journeys into the peculiar and the unexplained, consider subscribing. It helps us keep telling these stories, and it means we'll be here whenever you need something soft and strange to ease you into sleep. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day dissolve into the mattress beneath you. Tonight's story is a long one, and it doesn't have a clear ending. That's all right. The best stories for sleep rarely do. The Men in Black. You might know them from movies, those sharp-suited agents with their memory-erasing devices and their wry humour. But long before they became pop culture icons, long before they were softened into something safe and familiar, the Men in Black were something else entirely. They were whispers in the UFO community. They were the thing that happened after the thing that couldn't happen. They were the visitors who came after you'd already seen something impossible, as if to remind you that you hadn't seen enough. I've been thinking about them for weeks now, preparing this story, or maybe longer. It's strange how time works with certain subjects. Sometimes I wake up and I'm not entirely sure if I dreamed about the Men in Black or if I read about them the night before. The accounts blur together like watercolours left out in the rain. A pale face here, a too smooth voice there, the smell of something burning, or was it ozone? I can't always remember where one story ends and another begins. Maybe that's part of their design. Maybe forgetting is what they want. But let me try to tell you what I know, or what I think I know, or what I've pieced together from the edges of other people's nightmares. The Men in Black are not one thing. They are a phenomenon that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of conspiracy theory, paranormal encounter, and psychological experience. They appear in the testimonies of people who claim to have seen unidentified flying objects, who claim to have witnessed something that defied explanation. And then, days, or sometimes just hours later, these witnesses receive visitors. The visitors are almost always described the same way. Men, usually in groups of 2 or 3, dressed in black suits that seem either brand new or oddly outdated depending on the decade. Sometimes the suits don't quite fit right. Sometimes they're immaculate but wrong in ways that are hard to articulate. The ties are too narrow or too wide. The fabric looks expensive but feels off, like it's not quite made of any material you could name. Their faces are the most disturbing part. Pale, often described as unnaturally so. Sometimes witnesses say they had no eyebrows, no facial hair at all. Their skin might have an olive or greyish tint, as though they'd never seen sunlight, or as though they weren't quite alive in the way you and I understand life. Their eyes are dark, often hidden behind sunglasses even when they visit at night. When the glasses come off, witnesses describe eyes that don't blink enough or blink too much, or hold their gaze with an intensity that feels predatory. They speak in strange ways. Sometimes their voices are monotone, as though they're reading from a script they don't quite understand. Other times they speak too formally, using language that sounds like it was learned from a book rather than from living among people. They might ask questions that seem irrelevant. They might make statements that don't follow logically from what was just said. Conversations with the Men in Black have a disjointed, surreal quality, as though you're speaking to someone who learned how to be human but didn't quite master the performance. And they have one clear purpose, though they rarely state it directly. They want you to stop talking, stop telling people what you saw, stop filing reports, stop thinking about it if you can manage that. They imply consequences without making outright threats. They might mention your family members by name, people they shouldn't know about. They might describe the interior of your home in unsettling detail. They create an atmosphere of dread without ever raising their voices. Then they leave. Sometimes they walk away in a strange manner, moving stiffly or unnaturally. Sometimes they drive off in cars that witnesses swear shouldn't run, old models in pristine condition, or vehicles that seem to vanish too quickly around corners. And after they're gone, the witness is left with more questions than before, and a deep, gnawing fear that maybe they should have kept quiet after all. I first heard about the Men in Black years ago, though I can't pinpoint exactly when. It might have been in a documentary, or a book I picked up at a used bookstore, or maybe someone told me about them late one night in a conversation I've since forgotten. The details of my own introduction to them have become hazy, dreamlike, but once you know about them, they're hard to forget. They linger in your mind like a half-remembered nightmare. What makes the Men in Black so compelling, so persistently unsettling, is that they occupy a unique space in the taxonomy of the paranormal. They're not quite cryptids, not quite aliens, not quite government agents, though they've been theorized to be all three. They're liminal beings, threshold guardians who appear at the border between the known and the unknown. They show up precisely when someone has crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross, when someone has seen too much. And unlike many paranormal phenomena that become diluted or dismissed over time, the Men in Black reports have remained remarkably consistent across decades and across continents. The descriptions vary in small details, but the core experience remains the same. Something impossible happened. Then someone came to make sure you understood that speaking about impossible things carries a price. Are they real? That's the question everyone asks, and it's the question that doesn't quite fit. Real in what sense? People have reported these encounters. That much is documented. Whether the Men in Black are physical beings, psychological manifestations, interdimensional travelers, or something else entirely, the reports exist. The fear exists. The pattern exists. I think about the witnesses sometimes, lying in bed the night after such a visit. Do they replay the conversation, trying to make sense of it? Do they wonder if they imagined the whole thing? Do they feel the weight of the sunglasses still staring at them from across the kitchen table, even though the visitor is gone? Do they check the locks again? Or do they realize that locks won't matter if these visitors decide to return? The Men in Black are a story about power and silence. They're about the fear of being watched, of being known by something that shouldn't know you. They're about the terrible vulnerability of having seen something true that others would dismiss as fantasy. Because once you've seen a UFO, once you've witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to the rules we've all agreed upon, you're already isolated, you're already doubted, and then they come, these Men in Black, and they isolate you further. They remind you that you're alone with your knowledge, and that loneliness can be weaponized. But they're also, strangely, a story about the persistence of witnesses. Because despite the visits, despite the warnings, people still talk, people still file reports, people still tell their friends and neighbours what they saw in the sky that night. The Men in Black, for all their menace, have not succeeded in silencing the phenomenon they seem designed to suppress. If anything, their existence has become part of the phenomenon itself, another layer of strangeness added to an already strange experience. Some researchers believe the Men in Black are a form of folklore, a modern myth that arose naturally from the anxiety and paranoia of the Cold War era. Others think they're very real agents of very human organizations, using psychological warfare to discredit witnesses and maintain control over information. Still others believe they're not human at all, that they're aliens or interdimensional beings playing at being human and failing in subtle, uncanny ways. I don't know which theory is correct, I'm not sure anyone does. But tonight, we're going to walk through the history of these encounters together. We're going to visit the people who opened their doors to men they wish they'd never met. We're going to trace the legend from its origins in the 1950s to its strange evolution in the decades since. And along the way, I might drift. I might tell you things I'm not certain are true, memories that might be mine or might be borrowed from the accounts I've read. The Men in Black have that effect. They blur boundaries. They make you question what you know and how you know it. So if I seem uncertain sometimes, if I pause and wonder aloud whether a detail is real or imagined, forgive me. Or maybe don't think about it too much. Maybe just let the story wash over you like a dream you're already half forgetting. The night is long and dark outside your window. Somewhere, in some small town, someone might be hearing a knock at their door right now. Someone might be looking through a peephole to see a man in a black suit standing unnaturally still on their porch. But you're safe here, in your bed, listening to a voice tell you a story. You're just listening. You're not a witness. You have nothing to fear from the Men in black suits. At least not tonight. Let's begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can find. Let's go back to the 1950s, when the first reports started to surface, when the first witnesses began to whisper about visitors who came after the lights in the sky had gone. Men in Black, Section 2, Origins and Early Lore. The story begins, as far as we can trace it, in the early 1950s. The Second World War had ended. The atomic age had begun. The skies over America were full of things people couldn't explain, and suddenly everyone was looking up. Flying saucers, they called them. unidentified flying objects. Strange lights that moved in ways no airplane could move, that hovered and darted and vanished, leaving witnesses bewildered and a little afraid. In this atmosphere of wonder and paranoia, UFO clubs began forming. Amateur researchers started newsletters, collecting sighting reports, trying to make sense of the phenomenon through correspondence and careful documentation. These were ordinary people, enthusiasts, believers in the possibility that we weren't alone. They shared mimeographed pages filled with accounts and theories, building a community around their shared fascination with the unknown. One of these enthusiasts was a man named Albert K. Bender. He lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and in 1952 he founded something called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. It sounds grand, doesn't it? International Bureau. But it was really just Bender and his dedication, his typewriter, his newsletter, called Space Review. He collected reports from around the country, from around the world. He published them. He theorized. He was building something, a network of believers and researchers. And then, in September of 1953, he stopped. Abruptly. Completely. The newsletter ceased publication. The Bureau dissolved. Bender sent out a final message to his subscribers, brief and unsettling. He said he'd been visited. He said he knew the truth about flying saucers now, the real truth, but he'd been advised not to share it. Advised. That was the word he used. Not ordered, not threatened, advised. He said 3 men had come to see him. He said they wore black suits. He said he wouldn't say more. And then Albert K. Bender retreated from the UFO community, became silent on the subject, and stayed silent for years. This is where it starts. This is patient zero for the Men in Black legend, the first domino falling. But here's where my memory becomes uncertain, where the accounts I've read over the years start to blend and shift. I think Bender later said the men had glowing eyes. Or was that someone else? I have this image in my mind of him describing a smell, something like sulfur or burning metal, that accompanied the visitors. But when I try to find that detail in the documented accounts, it slips away from me. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe I'm confusing it with another case. Maybe someone told me once and I've carried it with me, half remembered, ever since. What we do know, what's documented, is that Bender's sudden withdrawal sent ripples through the small world of UFO research. People wanted to know what had happened. What had he learned? Who were these 3 men? Were they government agents? Were they something else? Years later, in 1963, Bender finally broke his silence. He wrote a book called Flying Saucers and the 3 Men. It was strange, confusing, filled with claims that even his fellow UFO researchers found difficult to believe. He described the men as not quite human, as beings from another world who could appear and disappear, who communicated telepathically, who took him aboard spacecraft. The book read like fever dream, part confession, part science fiction, part warning. Some people thought Bender had lost his grip on reality. Others thought he was deliberately muddying the waters, making his story so outlandish that the kernel of truth at its centre would be dismissed along with the embellishments. Still others wondered if this was exactly what the 3 men wanted, for him to tell a story so unbelievable that no one would take it seriously. I've never read the full book myself. Or have I? I think I started it once, found a scanned copy online or borrowed it from a library whose name I can't recall, but I only remember fragments. A description of a dark room, a sense of paralysis, the men standing over him, their presence oppressive, their message clear even when unspoken. Or maybe I'm remembering someone else's summary of the book, their interpretation filtering into my memory as though I'd experienced it firsthand. This is the problem with the Men in Black. They infect the way we remember things. They introduce uncertainty into the narrative. Was Bender visited by government agents trying to suppress UFO research? Was he contacted by aliens who wanted to control information about their presence? Did he have a psychological break brought on by stress and obsession? Or did he simply want attention and found that mystery was more compelling than mundane truth? We can't know. Bender is gone now, decades gone, and he took whatever really happened with him. But his story became the template, the archetype. After Bender, other people in the UFO community started reporting similar visits. Men in black suits, asking questions, making vague threats, creating an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. In 1956, a researcher and writer named Gray Barker published a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Barker had been corresponding with Bender before his silence, and he was fascinated by what had happened. His book popularized the idea of the men in black, gave them that specific name, that specific image. Dark suits, threatening presence, government credentials that might be fake, an agenda to silence and intimidate. Barker's book spread through the UFO community like wildfire. Suddenly the men in black were everywhere. People read about them and then, strangely, started experiencing them. A witness would see a UFO, report it, and then days later receive a visit from men in dark suits who asked intrusive questions and implied that continued discussion would be unwise. There's a chicken and egg question here that haunts me late at night. Did Barker's book create the phenomenon by giving people a framework to interpret ambiguous experiences? If you've just seen something impossible and you're feeling vulnerable and frightened, and then two men in suits show up at your door asking questions, are you more likely to remember them as sinister if you've just read about the men in black? Does the legend create the experience, or does the experience create the legend? I think about this more than I probably should. I think about how stories shape perception, how once you know what you're supposed to see, you start seeing it everywhere. The men in dark suits might have been insurance salesmen. They might have been actual government agents following up on air traffic reports. They might have been journalists or private investigators or neighbours checking on the local eccentric. But if you're expecting the men in black, if that template is sitting in your mind waiting to be filled, then suddenly ordinary visitors become sinister ones. But then there are the details that don't fit the mundane explanations. The witnesses who report that the men knew things they shouldn't know, private details about the witness's life, or about the sighting that hadn't been shared with anyone. The men who spoke in odd, stilted ways, who didn't seem to understand common social conventions. The men who arrived in cars that looked wrong, that sounded wrong, that sometimes left no tyre tracks on soft ground. These details pile up. They create a pattern that's harder to dismiss. And the pattern is consistent across years, across geographical locations, across witnesses who had no contact with each other, and sometimes no prior knowledge of the men in black phenomenon. I remember reading about a case, though I can't recall now where I read it or who the witness was. A man in the Midwest, sometime in the 1960s. He'd seen lights in the sky, dancing lights that moved with intelligence and purpose. He told his wife, his neighbours, filed a report with the local airport. Normal things that a curious person might do after an unusual experience. 3 days later, two men came to his door. Dark suits, white shirts, thin ties. They showed him identification that he couldn't quite read, badges that reflected light in strange ways. They asked him about the sighting, about every detail he could remember. Their questions were thorough but oddly phrased, as though English wasn't their first language, or as though they'd learned to speak by reading transcripts rather than by conversing with living people. Then one of them asked about his daughter, mentioned her by name, the daughter who lived 3 states away, whose married name was different from his. There was no reason these men should know about her, no reason her name should come up in a conversation about UFO sightings, but there it was, hanging in the air between them, not quite a threat, just information, offered casually, demonstrating knowledge that shouldn't exist. The men left after 20 minutes. The witness stood at his window and watched them walk to their car, a black sedan that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line in the 1940s, pristine and gleaming. They drove away. He never reported another UFO sighting, or maybe that didn't happen exactly that way. Maybe I'm conflating 2 different cases, weaving details together from different accounts into a single narrative that feels true even if it isn't precisely accurate. This is what the men in black do to memory. They create uncertainty. They make you doubt what you know and how you know it. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, these reports multiplied. Researchers began documenting them more carefully, trying to find patterns, trying to understand what was happening. Were these visitors government agents? The timing was right for that theory. The Cold War was in full swing. The Air Force was running Project Blue Book, officially investigating UFO sightings, while quietly trying to debunk them. It would make sense for there to be follow-up visits, intimidation tactics designed to keep witnesses quiet and prevent panic. But if they were government agents, why did they behave so strangely? Why the outdated suits, the odd speech patterns, the unsettling presence? Government intimidation is usually more professional, more subtle. These men seem to be performing the role of intimidating agents, rather than actually being intimidating agents, as though they'd learned the part from a script but didn't quite understand the character. Some researchers suggested they were foreign agents, Soviet or otherwise, trying to gather intelligence on American military installations by following up on UFO reports, which often occurred near sensitive sites. But that theory had its own problems. The men rarely asked questions that would be useful for intelligence gathering. They seemed more interested in silencing witnesses than in extracting information. And then there were the cases where the men seemed not to be human at all. Witnesses who reported that the visitors had strange eyes, or skin that looked artificial, or movements that were too precise and mechanical. Men who didn't seem to understand how to drink water, or who wore wigs that were obviously wigs, or who had trouble walking, as though gravity affected them differently than it should. These details push the phenomenon out of the realm of government conspiracy and into something stranger, something that resists easy explanation. Either witnesses are embellishing their accounts, adding bizarre details to make their stories more interesting, or something genuinely anomalous is happening. Something that doesn't fit into our comfortable categories of government agent or foreign spy or mundane visitor. I find myself returning to Bender sometimes, to that first case, that first silence. What did he really see? What did he really experience? Did 3 men in black suits really visit him in his apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in September of 1953? Did they really tell him secrets about flying saucers that he could never share? Or did something else happen, something more mundane or more strange, that his mind shaped into the story of the 3 men because that story made more sense than the raw, unprocessed experience? We build narratives to make sense of chaos. We create stories because stories have structure, causation, meaning. Random terror becomes a purposeful visit. Undefined dread becomes 3 men in suits with a message. The mind craves explanations, and sometimes the explanation we create is stranger than the event itself. But the events keep happening. The reports keep coming. Decade after decade, witnesses describe visits from men in black suits, men who don't quite belong, men who appear and disappear like figures from a dream. And each new report adds to the legend, reinforces the pattern, makes it harder to dismiss the entire phenomenon as fantasy or delusion. Somewhere in the 1950s, in the space between Bender's silence and Barker's book, the men in black became real. Not real in the sense that we can prove their existence, not real in the sense that we can study them scientifically, but real in the sense that they occupy space in our collective consciousness. Real in the sense that people fear them, avoid them, change their behavior because of them. And maybe that's all they ever needed to be. Maybe reality in this case is beside the point. Section 3, the Hopkins encounter. Of all the men in black cases I've read about over the years, there's one that stays with me more than the others. It surfaces in my thoughts at odd moments, usually late at night when the house is quiet and the darkness outside seems thicker than it should be. It's the case of Dr. Herbert Hopkins, and it happened in September of 1976 in Orchard Beach, Maine. Hopkins was a respected physician, a hypnotherapist, a man of science and reason. He was also consulting on a UFO case at the time, helping to investigate the claims of a man named David Stevens who believed he'd been abducted. Hopkins was using hypnosis to help recover Stevens' memories, trying to piece together what had happened during the missing time the man reported. It was careful work, professional work, the kind of investigation that required precision and skepticism. On the evening of September 11th, Hopkins was alone in his house. His wife and children were out watching a movie, if I remember correctly. Or maybe they were visiting relatives. The details of where his family was have blurred for me over the years, but the core of what happened remains sharp and clear, like a photograph I've looked at too many times. The phone rang. Hopkins answered. The voice on the other end identified itself as the vice president of the New Jersey UFO Research Organization. He said he was in the area and wondered if he could stop by to discuss the Stevens case. Hopkins, thinking this was a colleague, someone legitimate, agreed. The man said he'd be right over. Right over, those were the words. And here's where the strangeness begins, the first thread that unravels the normal fabric of the evening. Hopkins has said that he went to the porch light to turn it on, preparing for his visitor. But before he could reach the switch, before more than a minute or two could have passed since hanging up the phone, there was a knock at the door. The man was already there, already on the porch, as though he'd been waiting, as though the phone call had come from just outside the house, rather than from somewhere distant enough to require a drive. Hopkins opened the door, He saw a man in a black suit, black tie, white shirt. The suit was immaculate. The man was thin, very thin, and when Hopkins looked at his face, he felt something shift in his understanding of what was normal and what wasn't. The man was completely bald. No hair on his head at all, no eyebrows, no eyelashes. His skin was a dead white, not pale like someone who avoided the sun, but white like paper or wax. He wore bright red lipstick, vivid against that colourless skin, and when he moved his mouth to speak, the lipstick seemed wrong, theatrical, like stage makeup applied by someone who'd never seen a real human face up close. Hopkins invited him in. He doesn't remember why he invited him in. Looking back, the decision seemed automatic, unquestioned, as though some part of his mind had been bypassed. But he did. He opened the door wider, stepped aside, and the man in the black suit entered his home. They sat at the kitchen table. I picture this scene often, though I've never seen Hopkins's kitchen, never been to Orchard Beach, Maine. I imagine it anyway. The quiet house, the overhead light creating a circle of brightness in the darkness, the doctor and the visitor sitting across from each other, and the growing realization that something is terribly, fundamentally wrong. The man spoke in a monotone. His voice was flat, without inflection, without warmth. He asked questions about the Stevens case, but the questions were strange, disconnected. He seemed less interested in the details of the investigation than in establishing that he knew about it, that Hopkins's work was not as private as he'd believed. Then the man did something that Hopkins would later describe as one of the most unsettling moments of his life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin, a penny, bright and new. He held it in his gloved hand, the white glove contrasting with the copper shine of the coin. He told Hopkins to watch the penny. Hopkins watched. The penny began to change. It lost its definition, its solidity. It became blurry, indistinct. The colour shifted from copper to silver, fading, dissolving. And then it was gone. Not dropped, not hidden by sleight of hand. Gone. Vanished completely while Hopkins watched. The man said in that same flat voice that neither Hopkins nor anyone else on earth could do what he'd just done. He said it matter-of-factly, without boast or pride. Just a statement of reality. You cannot do this. I can. I've tried to imagine what that moment felt like. The rational mind struggling to process what the eyes have just seen. The coin was there, solid and real. Then it wasn't. No explanation that fits into the normal rules of physics. No trick that makes sense within the boundaries of what's possible. Just the impossible, happening quietly at a kitchen table in Maine. The visitor told Hopkins to destroy all his research on the Stevens case, not to stop investigating, to destroy what he'd already done, to erase it completely. He spoke about Barney Hill, another UFO witness, another New England case. He said that Barney Hill had died because he knew too much, and that Hopkins knew too much now as well. This wasn't true. Barney Hill had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, a medical event unrelated to his UFO experience years earlier. But the visitor stated it as fact, a warning wrapped in misinformation. Or maybe the visitor believed it. Maybe in whatever reality he came from, Barney Hill's death was caused by his knowledge. Maybe truth works differently for the men in black. Hopkins noticed other strange things as they sat together. The man's suit looked perfectly new but also outdated, styled in a way that belonged to an earlier decade. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as though he was operating a body that didn't quite fit him. When he gestured, his hands moved in precise, angular ways that seemed choreographed rather than natural. And then the man said something that Hopkins would never forget. He said in that emotionless voice that his energy was running low, as though he were a machine, a device that needed recharging. He stood up, moving carefully, and said he had to leave. He walked to the door with an odd, unsteady gait. Hopkins followed, watching this strange visitor make his way out of the house. At the door, the man turned and said something about following the instructions he'd been given. Then he walked down the steps to the driveway. Hopkins watched from the doorway. He saw the man walk to a car, though he couldn't later describe the car with any certainty. He remembers a bright light, unusually bright, as though the headlights were far more powerful than normal car lights should be. The man got into the car, or seemed to, and then the car moved away down the street, the light fading, and Hopkins was left standing in his doorway, trying to understand what had just happened in his kitchen. He went back inside. The house felt different now, contaminated somehow by the visit. He looked at the chair where the man had sat, half expecting it to still hold some trace of that presence. But it was just a chair, just his kitchen, just his normal life, except nothing felt normal anymore. Hopkins destroyed his research on the Stevens case. All of it. Every tape, every note, every document. He withdrew from UFO investigation completely. Years later, when he finally spoke publicly about the encounter, he still seemed shaken by it, still uncertain about what had really happened in his kitchen that September evening. I've read several versions of this story over the years. Sometimes the details vary slightly. In some accounts, the man removes his glove and his hand appears strange, discoloured. In others, he wipes his mouth and the lipstick smears onto his glove, revealing grey skin underneath. I can't always remember which details come from Hopkins' original account, and which have been added by retellings, by the process of the story being told and retold until it becomes smoothed and shaped by repetition. But some details remain consistent across every version. The bald head, the dead white skin, the lipstick, the vanishing coin, the claim of running out of energy. These are the anchors, the elements that don't shift no matter how many times the story is passed along. Sometimes, late at night, I have dreams about that kitchen table. In the dreams, I'm sitting where Hopkins sat, and across from me is a figure in a black suit. I can never quite see his face clearly, but I know he's watching me. I know he's about to show me something, about to make something impossible happen right before my eyes, and then I wake up, and I'm not sure if I dreamed it, or if I read it somewhere, or if somehow the story has become so deeply lodged in my mind that it plays out in my sleep like a memory that isn't mine. There's something about the Hopkins case that distills the Men in Black phenomenon into its purest, most unsettling form. Here's a credible witness, a professional, a skeptic by training, describing an encounter that defies every rational explanation. He wasn't seeking attention. He didn't publicize the incident immediately. He withdrew from UFO research entirely, which is the opposite of what you'd expect from someone fabricating a story for fame. And the details of the encounter are so specific, so bizarre, that they're hard to explain as misidentification or misunderstanding. If Hopkins was visited by a government agent, why the pale skin and lipstick? Why the theatrical strangeness? Why the vanishing coin trick? Government intimidation doesn't usually involve stage magic and claims of depleted energy. If he was visited by someone playing a prank, who was it? Who would go to such lengths, with such elaborate makeup and costuming, to frighten a man investigating a UFO case? And how did they arrive so impossibly fast after the phone call? How did they make the coin disappear? If Hopkins imagined or hallucinated the entire encounter, why did he react by destroying his research? Why the lasting trauma, the years of silence before he felt able to discuss it? Hallucinations usually don't have such concrete, long-lasting effects on behaviour. The skeptical explanations don't quite fit. The believer explanations, aliens in disguise or interdimensional beings, are too strange to accept easily. And so, the Hopkins case sits in that uncomfortable middle space, that liminal zone where the Men in Black live, neither provably real nor easily dismissed. A story that happened to someone, whether in consensus reality or in some other layer of experience that intersects with our own. I think about Hopkins alone in his house after the visitor left, the silence of the empty rooms, the memory of that flat voice, those instructions, that impossible vanishing coin. Did he check the locks? Did he call his wife? Tell her to come home early? Did he sit at that kitchen table and try to reason through what had happened? Or did he know immediately that reason wouldn't help, that some experiences exist outside the boundaries of rational analysis? The thing that haunts me most about this case, the detail that surfaces in my thoughts again and again, is the claim of running low on energy. It's such a strange, specific thing to say. It implies that the visitor was something that operated on a limited power source, something that needed to return to a base or a source before it could no longer maintain its form or function. Sometimes I picture the man in the black suit getting into that car with the two bright lights, and I imagine him sitting in the driver's seat, that mechanical precision beginning to falter, the makeup starting to smear, the careful human mimicry breaking down as the energy depletes, and I imagine him driving through the dark main roads, racing against some internal countdown, trying to reach wherever he needed to be before the performance ended completely, Or maybe I imagine that because I need there to be an explanation, even a strange one. Maybe I need to believe that the visitor came from somewhere and returned somewhere, that there's a logic to it, however alien. Because the alternative, that he simply appeared and disappeared with no origin and no destination, is harder to accept. It's too much like a dream, too much like something that exists only in the moment of encounter and nowhere else. But dreams can have consequences. Hopkins destroyed his research. He left UFO investigation, the encounter where the dream or reality changed the course of his life, and maybe that's what the men in black do best. Not convince us of their reality, but change our behaviour as though they were real. The effect is the same either way. It's very late now. The house is quiet around you. If you heard a knock at your door right now, would you answer it? If you saw a man in a black suit standing on your porch, his face too pale, his manner too strange, would you invite him in? Or would you remember the Hopkins case? Remember the warning implicit in that story, and keep the door closed. Sleep now. The men in black only visit witnesses. You haven't seen anything you shouldn't have seen. You're safe in the dark, safe in the quiet. The knock, if it comes, will be for someone else. Section 4. Keel's Reports and Hotel Visitors. In the late 1960s, a journalist and researcher named John Keel became fascinated with the men in black. Keel wasn't like many UFO investigators of his time. He didn't approach the phenomenon with the assumption that flying saucers were spacecraft from other planets. Instead, he saw something stranger happening, something that blurred the boundaries between paranormal experiences, folklore, and mass psychology. He followed the threads wherever they led, and many of those threads led to men in black suits. Keel spent time in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, during the Mothman flap of 1966 and 67. If you know that story, you know it's strange enough on its own. Strange lights in the sky, a creature with red eyes and wings spotted by dozens of witnesses, phone calls that came from nowhere, a sense of dread that hung over the town like fog, and woven through all of it, reports of men in dark suits asking questions, appearing in odd places, behaving in ways that didn't quite fit. Keel documented these encounters carefully. He collected accounts from witnesses who'd seen the men, who'd spoken with them, who'd been left unsettled by the exchanges. And what emerged from his research was a portrait of the men in black that was even stranger than the earlier cases suggested. These weren't just intimidating visitors. They were something fundamentally wrong, something that didn't belong in the normal flow of reality. Witnesses told Keel about men who appeared at their doors claiming to be from the government, from the Air Force, from organizations that didn't exist when investigated. The men carried identification that looked official at first glance but fell apart under scrutiny. Badge numbers that led nowhere. Agency names that were almost correct but not quite. As though someone had created credentials based on research but had gotten the details slightly wrong. The men asked questions that made no sense. They'd ask about the witness's sighting, but then veer off into non sequiturs. They'd mention unrelated details about the witness's life, personal information they shouldn't have access to, but would do so in a way that felt random rather than threatening. It was as though they were following a script but occasionally forgetting their lines, improvising badly, revealing that they didn't quite understand the role they were playing. Keel heard stories about the men's strange physical presence. Several witnesses described a particular smell associated with them, something like sulfur or ozone, a sharp chemical scent that lingered after they left. Others mentioned that the men seemed to have difficulty with basic motor skills, that they moved stiffly or awkwardly, that their gestures seemed practiced rather than natural. One account that Keel documented, and I'm pulling this from memory so the details might shift, involved a woman who encountered two men in a hotel lobby. She was there for reasons unrelated to UFOs, just a normal evening, but the men approached her and began asking strange questions. They wanted to know if she'd seen any unusual lights recently. They asked about her dreams. They stood too close, invaded her personal space in a way that felt deliberately unsettling. She noticed their clothes first. Black suits, yes, but the fabric seemed wrong. Too shiny, or too dull, or simply made of material that didn't move the way cloth should move. Their ties were identical, perfectly knotted, but an unusual colour she couldn't quite name later when trying to describe them. Their faces were worse. Both men had the same features, as though they were twins or perhaps copies of the same original. Their skin had an odd texture, slightly waxy, and their eyes didn't track properly. When one looked at her, his eyes moved in coordination, but seemed to be looking at two slightly different points, creating a sense of double vision, of not quite being seen correctly. The conversation, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 5 minutes. The men asked their questions in that same flat monotone that other witnesses had reported. The woman answered, mostly out of confusion and a desire to end the interaction, and then the men simply walked away, moving in perfect synchronization, their steps timed identically, heading toward the exit. She watched them go. She told Keel that she had this overwhelming urge to follow them, to see where they were going, what kind of car they drove, but something held her back, some survival instinct that said following would be a terrible mistake. So she stayed in the lobby, and she watched them disappear into the night, and she never saw them again. But here's the detail that stayed with her, the part that troubled her for years afterward. As they were leaving, she noticed their shoes. Both men wore the same style, black leather, perfectly polished. But when they walked across the lobby floor, they made no sound, no footsteps, no tap of heels on tile. They moved in complete silence, as though they weren't quite touching the ground, or as though the sounds they made existed in a different frequency that human ears couldn't detect. Keel collected dozens of stories like this. Men appearing in public places, hotels, restaurants, gas stations. Men who seemed to be watching witnesses, following them, creating a sense of surveillance that was both obvious and unverifiable. You'd see them in the background, standing too still, staring too long. But by the time you thought to approach them, or report them to someone, they were gone, vanished between one moment and the next. There were phone calls too, strange phone calls that came at odd hours. The voice on the other end might be mechanical, obviously artificial, or it might sound almost human but wrong in subtle ways. The caller would have information they shouldn't have. They'd mention the witness's sighting, or their family members, or their work schedule. Sometimes the voice would threaten vaguely. Other times it would simply state facts, letting the implication hang unspoken. Witnesses who received these calls often reported problems with their phone lines afterward. Strange clicks and buzzes, conversations that seemed to echo or overlap with other conversations happening elsewhere. The sense that someone was always listening, that the line was never truly private. Keel himself experienced some of these phenomena. He wrote about receiving mysterious calls, about feeling watched, about encounters with strange individuals who knew too much about his research. Whether this was paranoia brought on by immersion in paranoid material, or whether something was genuinely happening to him, is impossible to determine from this distance. But he documented it all, added it to the growing file of men in black strangeness. I've spent hours, maybe days if you added them all together, reading through Keel's work, his books, his articles, interviews he gave, and I have this memory, though I can't place where it comes from, of Keel describing a particular hotel in Point Pleasant. He said witnesses kept seeing the same men in the lobby, night after night, always dressed in black, always sitting in the same chairs, never seeming to sleep or eat or do anything except watch the people coming and going. But when I try to find that specific account, when I search through the books and articles I think I remember reading, the story isn't there. Or it is, but different. Maybe it wasn't Point Pleasant. Maybe it wasn't a hotel. Maybe I dreamed it, or conflated it with another account from another researcher in another town. The men in black have this effect on memory. They make everything uncertain, even your own recollections of reading about them. There's a particular case that Keel investigated, and this one I'm more certain about, though certainty feels slippery these days. A couple in West Virginia saw strange lights in the sky one night. Classic UFO sighting, lights moving in formation, performing maneuvers that no conventional aircraft could perform. They watched for maybe 20 minutes, then the lights vanished, and they went home. 3 nights later, they were at a drive-in movie. It was late, after 10 o'clock, and the drive-in was nearly empty. During the movie, they noticed a car parked a few spaces away. A black sedan, older model but in pristine condition. Inside were 2 figures, both wearing dark suits and hats, pulled low. The figures weren't watching the movie. They were facing toward the couple's car, just sitting there, motionless, staring. The couple tried to ignore them. They focused on the movie, told themselves it was nothing, just other patrons who happened to be parked nearby. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming, oppressive. Finally, the husband got out of the car and walked toward the sedan, intending to confront whoever was inside. As he approached, the sedan's engine started. He hadn't seen anyone reach for keys, hadn't heard the normal sounds of someone preparing to leave. The engine just started suddenly, and the car pulled away. It didn't exit through the main gates. It drove across the field behind the screen, across rough ground that should have damaged the vehicle, and disappeared into the darkness beyond. The husband stood there in the empty space where the car had been, trying to process what he'd just seen. When he returned to his own vehicle, his wife was pale, shaken. She said that as the sedan pulled away, both figures in the front seat had turned to look at her. Their faces had been visible for just a moment in the reflected glow of the movie screen. She couldn't describe their features clearly, couldn't say exactly what they looked like. But she knew with absolute certainty that they weren't human. Something about the eyes, or the way the face moved, or simply an instinctual recognition that what she was looking at was wearing a human shape but wasn't human inside it. They left the drive-in immediately. They didn't report the incident to anyone official. They didn't talk about their UFO sighting again. And whenever anyone asked why they'd stopped going to the drive-in, a place they'd visited regularly for years, they'd make excuses about the quality of the movies or the inconvenience of the location. They never mentioned the sedan or the figures inside it. Keel documented so many cases like this. Encounters in parking lots and diners and gas stations. Men in black suits appearing in places they shouldn't be, at times that didn't make sense, behaving in ways that violated social norms. The sheer volume of reports, the consistency of the strange details across unrelated witnesses, created a weight of evidence that was hard to dismiss entirely. But what was the evidence actually pointing to? That's what troubled Keel, and it's what troubles me now, thinking about all these cases in the quiet hours when sleep won't come. If these were government agents, they were doing a terrible job of being covert. They drew attention to themselves with their odd behaviour, their strange appearance, their unsettling presence. Real intimidation, real surveillance is usually invisible. You don't know you're being watched until it's too late. If they were aliens in disguise, they were remarkably bad at impersonating humans. The errors were too obvious, too consistent. It was as though they wanted to be recognised as other, as though the goal wasn't to blend in but to be seen as not quite human. Keel eventually developed a theory that the men in black were something he called ultra-terrestrials, beings from another dimension or plane of reality that intersected with ours. They could take physical form, but imperfectly, and they fed on human fear and confusion. The UFO sightings were bait, a way to create witnesses who could then be visited, frightened, their emotional energy harvested somehow. It's a wild theory, the kind that sounds like science fiction or occult philosophy more than serious research. But when you immerse yourself in the cases, when you read account after account of these impossible encounters, mainstream explanations start to feel insufficient. The mind reaches for something, anything, that might make sense of the pattern, even if that something requires accepting realities we prefer not to believe in. I've never seen a man in black. I should say that clearly. I've never answered my door to find a pale figure in an outdated suit asking questions in a monotone. I've never received strange phone calls or felt watched by men who vanish when approached. My engagement with this phenomenon is entirely second-hand, filtered through books and articles and late-night research sessions that blend together in memory. But sometimes in hotels I find myself watching the lobby, looking at the people who sit in those uncomfortable chairs near the elevators, who seem to have no luggage and no clear purpose. Most of them are perfectly normal, of course, travellers waiting for rides, business people taking calls, the ordinary traffic of transient spaces, but occasionally there's someone who sits a little too still, who watches a little too intently, whose clothes seem slightly wrong in ways I can't articulate. And I remember Keel's accounts of hotel encounters, and I wonder if the men in black are still doing their rounds, still appearing in liminal spaces where their strangeness can be more easily dismissed or forgotten. Or maybe I'm just tired, and tired minds see patterns where none exist. Maybe the men in black are a kind of shared hallucination, a cultural boogeyman that we've collectively agreed to believe in because the alternative, that UFO witnesses are just regular people with regular experiences, is somehow less satisfying than the idea of mysterious visitors enforcing cosmic secrecy. But the witnesses weren't satisfied by their experiences. They were frightened, they were changed, and their fear was real, whatever caused it. That much is certain, even when everything else dissolves into uncertainty and dream. Section 5. Vanishing cars and disappearing agents. There's something particularly unsettling about the vehicles the men in black drive. If they were simply strange men asking strange questions, that would be disturbing enough. But the cars add another layer of impossibility, another detail that pushes these encounters beyond the boundaries of what we can easily explain. The cars are often described as old, models from the 1940s or 50s, decades out of date even when the encounters occur in the 70s or 80s, but they're in perfect condition, immaculate, as though they've just rolled off the assembly line. No rust, no wear, no signs of age despite being vintage vehicles. They're usually black, sometimes an unnaturally deep black that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they behave strangely. They appear and disappear in ways that cars shouldn't. They drive on roads that don't exist, or vanish around corners that lead nowhere. Witnesses watch them leave, following their taillights with their eyes, and then the lights simply cease to exist. Not driving away into the distance, not turning onto another street, just gone between one moment and the next. One of the most famous cases involving a vanishing car happened to a man named Robert Richardson in 1967. Richardson was driving home late one night in Toledo, Ohio, when he saw something in the road ahead. A dark shape, difficult to make out in the darkness. He slowed down but couldn't stop in time. He felt an impact, heard a metallic sound, and then the object was gone. He got out of his car to investigate. There was no damage to his vehicle, no sign of what he'd hit. But on the road he found a small piece of metal, jagged and strange. He picked it up, took it home, and later had it analysed. The metal turned out to be an unusual alloy, not impossible but uncommon, the kind of material that raised questions without providing answers. About a week after the incident, two men came to Richardson's home. They wore black suits and showed identification claiming they were from a government agency. They asked about the object he'd hit, about the piece of metal he'd recovered. Richardson told them he'd sent it to a research organisation for analysis. The men insisted he retrieve it. They said it was important, that he needed to get it back and turn it over to them. Richardson refused. He'd sent the metal away for study, and that was that. The men left, but their parting words stayed with him. They said that if he valued his wife, he'd get the metal back and give it to them. Not an overt threat exactly, but the implication was clear. Your wife. Remember your wife. Remember that we know about your wife. A few days later, two different men appeared. These wore black suits as well, but they were even stranger than the first pair. One of them had a completely smooth face, as though he'd never grown a beard in his life. His skin looked artificial, plastic almost. He spoke with an accent that Richardson couldn't place, questions phrased in awkward ways that suggested English wasn't his native language, or perhaps that language itself wasn't native to him. They asked the same questions about the metal. They pushed harder, more insistent. And then they left, climbing into a black Cadillac that was parked outside. Richardson watched them drive away. He watched the Cadillac reach the end of his street, watched it turn the corner, and then he walked to the corner himself, curious about where they were going. The street was empty. The Cadillac was nowhere to be seen. There were no side streets it could have turned onto, no driveways it could have pulled into. The road stretched straight ahead for several blocks, clear visibility, and there was no car. It had simply vanished. I think about that moment often. Richardson standing at the corner, looking down an empty street, trying to reconcile what his eyes had just seen with what his mind knew was possible. The car had been there. He'd watched it drive away. But it wasn't there anymore, and there was nowhere it could have gone in the seconds between leaving his house and reaching the corner. What do you do with information like that? How do you file it away in your mental catalogue of experiences? Do you tell yourself you must have been mistaken, that you didn't see what you thought you saw? Do you accept that something impossible happened and try to live with that knowledge? Or do you simply stop thinking about it, push it down into the basement of your mind where uncomfortable things go to gather dust? There are other cases of vanishing vehicles. A researcher in California watched two men in black get into a black sedan after visiting a UFO witness. The car drove down the street, but it never reached the intersection at the end of the block. It was there, moving at normal speed, and then it wasn't. The researcher even walked the length of the street afterward, checking every driveway and alley, finding no explanation for where the vehicle could have gone. In another incident, a witness in New England saw men in black leaving his neighbour's house. They got into what looked like a 1950s Buick, pristine and gleaming. The witness noticed something odd about the car as it drove past his house. The wheels weren't quite touching the ground. They were close, perhaps an inch or two above the pavement, and they were spinning, but there was no contact. The car glided by, silent except for a faint humming sound, and then it turned onto the main road and was gone. Or maybe the wheels were touching the ground and it was a trick of the light, a trick of memory, a detail added later when the witness was trying to explain why the car had felt so wrong. I've read different versions of this account, and sometimes the hovering wheels are mentioned and sometimes they're not. But the feeling of wrongness, the sense that this was not a normal vehicle, that remains consistent. Some witnesses describe the cars as making no sound at all. No engine noise, no tyres on pavement, just silence as they appear and disappear. Others report sounds that are wrong, too loud or too quiet, or the wrong pitch for the type of vehicle they're supposedly observing. It's as though the men in black understand that they need cars to fit in, to appear normal, but they haven't quite mastered the details. The cars are a costume, like the suits and the human faces, and the costume doesn't fit perfectly. There's a case I remember reading about, though the source escapes me now. Might have been in one of Keel's books, or Valise, or perhaps in some obscure newsletter I found online years ago. A woman in the Midwest had seen a UFO and reported it to the local police. 2 nights later, she heard a car pull up outside her house very late, after midnight. She looked out the window and saw a black sedan, engine running, lights on, but nobody got out. The car just sat there, idling in front of her house. She watched for perhaps 10 minutes, growing more nervous with each passing moment. Finally, she called the police to report a suspicious vehicle. While she was on the phone, still watching the car through her window, it simply wasn't there anymore. The lights went out, or the car vanished, or something happened that her mind couldn't quite process. The dispatcher asked for the license plate number, and the woman realized she couldn't remember looking at the license plate. She'd been watching the car for 10 minutes, but she'd never looked at the plate, or if she had, the information hadn't registered. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, there was no sign that a car had been parked there. No tyre marks on the soft ground near the curb. No oil drips or any evidence that a vehicle had been idling in that spot. The officer took her report politely, but clearly didn't believe her story. Why would a car park outside her house, do nothing, and then leave before police arrived? It didn't make sense. But in the context of men in black encounters, it makes perfect sense. Or rather, it makes the same kind of nonsense that characterizes all these cases. The logic is wrong, the purpose unclear, the execution bizarre. But it achieves something, doesn't it? It unsettles. It creates fear and confusion. It makes the witness question their own perceptions, their own sanity. I've never seen a car vanish. I should make that clear. I've spent a lot of time thinking about cars that vanish, reading about them, trying to understand the mechanics of how something solid and physical could simply cease to exist. But I've never witnessed it personally. My engagement with this phenomenon is entirely abstract, intellectual, the safe distance of someone reading about other people's impossible experiences. Though sometimes, driving at night, I see cars in my rearview mirror that seem to be following too consistently. Cars that maintain the same distance no matter how fast or slow I drive. And I think about the Men in Black reports, about witnesses who described being followed by vehicles that never got closer but never fell behind. And I tell myself it's just coincidence, just normal traffic patterns, just the paranoia that comes from spending too much time reading about conspiracies and cover-ups. The cars always turn off eventually. They take an exit or turn onto a side street and I continue on my way, and there's never any vanishing, never any impossibility. Just ordinary vehicles driven by ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. But for those few minutes before they turn away, there's a tension, an alertness, a part of my mind that's running through scenarios of what I would do if the car following me turned out to be something other than ordinary. There are accounts of men in black vehicles that behave in even stranger ways. Cars that drive up steep embankments that no normal vehicle could climb. Cars that cross rivers without bridges. Cars that appear on roads that witnesses swear weren't there a moment before. Each case adds to the accumulation of wrongness, the sense that these are not vehicles in any conventional sense but rather props, stage dressing, three-dimensional images projected to create the illusion of normalcy, while simultaneously failing at that illusion in subtle, disturbing ways. In some reports, witnesses manage to get close enough to look inside the vehicles before the men in black depart. They describe interiors that are wrong, dashboard layouts that don't match the make and model of the car, or dashboards that are completely blank, no instruments at all. seats that look like they're made of a single piece of material rather than upholstered properly. Everything too clean, too perfect. Like a display model rather than a functioning vehicle. One witness, and I wish I could remember where I read this, described seeing a man in black sitting in a parked car. The witness walked past on the sidewalk, glanced through the window, and saw the figure in the driver's seat. But the figure wasn't quite sitting. It was positioned in a sitting posture, but there was something wrong about the proportions, the angle, as though it didn't quite understand how humans sit or how cars are designed to accommodate human bodies. The figure was too rigid, too straight, like a mannequin placed in the seat by someone who'd only seen people sitting in cars from a distance. These details pile up. They create a composite picture of vehicles that are imitations, copies made by something that understands the general concept of a car, but hasn't mastered the specifics. Or perhaps they're something else entirely, some kind of technology that looks like cars because that's what we expect to see, a visual translation of something that exists in forms we can't perceive directly. I don't know. I've read so many theories over the years, so many attempts to explain the unexplainable. Some researchers think the cars are projections, holographic images that have no physical substance. Others believe they're from our future, time machines disguised as vintage vehicles. Still others suggest they're interdimensional, here and not here simultaneously, which is why they can vanish so easily. But theories don't capture the experience of watching a car disappear. They don't convey the profound wrongness of seeing something solid and physical simply cease to exist. Richardson standing at that corner, looking down an empty street. The California researcher walking the block searching for an explanation. The woman watching the car outside her house flicker out of existence while she was on the phone with police. These are the moments that theories can't touch. These are the experiences that resist explanation, that sit uncomfortably in memory, that surface years later in quiet moments, and make you question what you think you know about how reality works. The men in black drive cars that shouldn't exist, that behave in impossible ways, that vanish leaving no trace, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the impossibility is deliberate. Maybe they want us to see that our understanding of the physical world is incomplete, that there are gaps in our knowledge large enough for black sedans to slip through and disappear. Or maybe I'm reading too much into random anomalies and unreliable testimony. Maybe cars don't vanish. Maybe witnesses misremember or exaggerate or fill in gaps in their perception, with details that seem more dramatic than what actually happened. Maybe the whole phenomenon is just a collection of mistakes and misunderstandings, given shape by expectation and fear. But Richardson saw what he saw. The researcher walked that empty block. The woman watched that car disappear. And somewhere, perhaps right now, someone is watching a black sedan pull away from their house, watching it reach the end of their street, watching it turn the corner into impossible absence. Sleep now. Your own car is parked safely wherever you left it. Solid, physical, bound by all the normal rules. In the morning it will still be there, ordinary and mundane, ready to take you wherever you need to go. The men in black drive cars that vanish, but your car is real and you are real, and the line between the two remains solid. For now. Section 6. Theories and Interpretations. So what are they? That's the question that circles back again and again, that keeps researchers awake long after they should have put the files away and turned off the lights. What are the men in black? Where do they come from? What do they want? There are theories. So many theories. Some simple, some elaborate, some that seem reasonable until you examine them closely and find they don't quite account for all the details. Let me walk you through them, gently, the way someone might sort through old photographs late at night, holding each one up to the light, trying to remember when and where it was taken. The most straightforward explanation is that the men in black are exactly what they sometimes claim to be: government agents. Specifically, agents working for intelligence organizations concerned with maintaining secrecy around military installations, experimental aircraft, or sensitive operations that civilians might mistake for UFOs. This makes sense on the surface. During the Cold War, the government had every reason to suppress information about advanced technology, radar installations, high-altitude testing. If civilians were seeing things in the sky and talking about them publicly, it would be natural for agencies to send representatives to encourage silence. Show up at someone's door, flash credentials, ask some questions, imply that continued discussion might cause problems. Standard intimidation tactics. And some men in black encounters do fit this pattern. Witnesses who saw unusual aircraft near military bases. People who photographed objects that might have been classified technology. In these cases, a visit from stern men in dark suits makes procedural sense, even if it's heavy-handed. But this explanation falls apart when you examine the stranger cases. Government agents don't show up wearing outdated suits and theatrical makeup. They don't speak in monotones or claim to be running out of energy. They don't drive cars that vanish or perform magic tricks with disappearing coins. Real intimidation is professional, subtle, effective. The men in black are often too strange to be effective intimidators, too memorable in their wrongness. Unless that's the point. Unless the strangeness is deliberate, designed to make witnesses seem unreliable. If you report a UFO and then claim you were visited by a pale man with no eyebrows who made a coin disappear, who's going to believe you? The strangeness of the Men in Black encounter undermines the credibility of the initial sighting. It's a brilliant strategy, really. Don't suppress the story, just make it weirder. Push it into the realm of the obviously absurd. But that requires a level of psychological sophistication and theatrical commitment that seems unlikely for bureaucratic organizations. Government agents work from manuals and protocols. They don't improvise elaborate performances involving prosthetic makeup and stage magic. And how do you explain the cars that vanish, the vehicles that hover, the impossibilities that accumulate around these encounters? So maybe they're not government agents. Maybe they're foreign operatives, spies from other countries trying to gather intelligence about UFO sightings near sensitive locations. This theory has some merit. During the Cold War, both sides were desperate for information about the other's capabilities. If American civilians were seeing things in the sky and reporting them, it would make sense for Soviet agents to follow up, to investigate whether these sightings represented new American technology. But again, the details don't fit. Foreign spies need to blend in, to be invisible. They don't draw attention to themselves with bizarre behavior and anachronistic clothing. They don't make themselves memorable. And the phenomenon has continued long after the Cold War ended, long after the primary motivation for such operations would have dissolved. Then there are the extraterrestrial theories. The idea that the Men in Black are aliens themselves, either visitors from other worlds or perhaps hybrids, beings created to interface between human and alien civilizations. They're here to monitor UFO witnesses, to assess how much humans have seen and understood, to manage information and prevent widespread awareness of alien presence. This explains some of the strangeness. If they're not human, of course they wouldn't quite get the details right. The outdated suits could be their best guess at formal human attire, based on outdated information or cultural analysis. The stilted speech patterns could be the result of learning human language without fully grasping human social dynamics. The pale skin, the missing hair, the wrong proportions, all evidence of being not quite human, trying to pass as human and failing in subtle ways. The vanishing cars make more sense in this context too. If they have access to technology beyond our understanding, vehicles that can dematerialize or phase out of our dimension wouldn't be impossible, just advanced. The coin trick Hopkins witnessed wouldn't be magic, just technology we can't comprehend, made to look like magic. But if they're aliens with advanced technology, why visit witnesses at all? Why not simply erase memories or prevent sightings in the first place? Why the elaborate theatre of knocking on doors and having awkward conversations? It seems inefficient, unnecessarily complicated. Unless they're bound by rules we don't understand, limitations on how they can interact with us, or unless the interaction itself serves a purpose beyond simple intimidation. Some researchers, Keel among them, suggest that the Men in Black are interdimensional beings, entities that exist in realities adjacent to our own. They can cross over, take physical or semi-physical form, but they don't fully understand our world because they're not from our world. They're tourists, essentially, or investigators from a parallel dimension where physics works differently, and human norms don't apply. This is a harder theory to evaluate because it's not falsifiable. You can't prove or disprove the existence of other dimensions, but it does account for the dreamlike quality of the encounters, the sense that the Men in Black exist in a space between real and unreal, physical and psychological. If they're partially here and partially elsewhere, it might explain why they seem solid but can vanish, why they drive cars that behave impossibly, why witnesses sometimes feel they might have dreamed the whole thing despite physical evidence that something occurred. There's another category of explanation, one that turns inward rather than outward. Psychological theories that suggest the Men in Black are manifestations of fear and guilt. projections created by the witness's own mind in response to the trauma of a UFO sighting. Seeing something that shouldn't exist is psychologically destabilizing. It undermines your understanding of reality, creates anxiety and uncertainty. Some researchers propose that the mind, trying to process this trauma, creates a secondary narrative. The men in black become embodiments of the witness's fear of consequences, their guilt about speaking out, their anxiety about being believed or dismissed. The visit isn't real in a physical sense, but it's real in terms of psychological experience. This explains why the men in black often embody contradictory qualities. They're authority figures, but also outsiders. They're threatening, but also absurd. They represent both the government and the alien, both the mundane and the impossible. They're whatever the witness needs them to be to justify their fear and explain their desire to remain silent. But this theory struggles with cases where multiple witnesses see the men in black, or where physical evidence exists, like the metal fragment Richardson found, or the cars that neighbours confirm seeing. Shared hallucinations are rare. Multiple witnesses experiencing identical psychological projections seems unlikely. Unless we expand the theory to include something like collective consciousness or morphic fields, the idea that humans share a psychological space where archetypes and fears can take form that multiple people can perceive. The men in black as tulpas, thought forms given substance by collective belief and fear. The more people believe in them, the more real they become, until they achieve a kind of quasi-physical existence that bridges mind and matter. I don't know if I believe that. I'm not sure I believe any single theory completely. Each one explains some cases while leaving others mysterious. Each one feels like it's grasping at part of the truth, but missing the larger picture. Maybe there isn't a single explanation. Maybe the men in black are different things in different encounters. Sometimes government agents, sometimes foreign operatives, sometimes witnesses misidentifying ordinary visitors through the lens of fear and expectation, sometimes something genuinely anomalous that we don't have the framework to understand. Or maybe they're all of these things simultaneously somehow. Maybe they exist in that liminal space where multiple realities overlap, where the psychological and the physical aren't as separate as we usually think. Maybe they're what happens when human consciousness encounters something it can't process, and the encounter generates its own reality that's neither fully subjective nor fully objective. I think about this late at night, when the house is quiet and sleep feels distant. I think about all the theories I've read, all the attempts to categorize and explain, and I realize that my own memories of reading these theories have become uncertain. Did I read about tulpas in a book about the men in black, or was it in something about Tibetan Buddhism that I'm now applying to this phenomenon? Did Keel really propose interdimensional beings, or am I attributing that theory to him because it sounds like something he would have said? The men in black infect everything, even your certainty about your own knowledge. They make you question not just what you know, but how you know it, whether the information in your head is reliable, or whether it's been subtly altered. The way a word changes meaning when you repeat it too many times. There are theories I haven't mentioned yet. Theories that the men in black are time travelers from our future, enforcing some kind of temporal protocol by preventing information about UFOs from spreading too widely. Theories that they're artificial intelligences, robots or androids sent by some unknown organization. Theories that they're demons or fallen angels, supernatural entities that have always visited humanity, but adapted their appearance to match modern expectations. Each theory has its proponents, its evidence, its logic. Each one makes sense within its own framework, and each one fails to account for something, leaves gaps that other theories rush in to fill. The truth, if there is a single truth, remains elusive. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe mystery is the natural state of this phenomenon. Maybe the men in black are supposed to be unexplainable, and all our theories are just attempts to make ourselves comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. I prefer some theories over others, though I'm not sure my preferences are based on evidence so much as on which explanations feel right, which ones resonate with my own sense of how reality works. I lean toward the idea that different encounters have different explanations, that the men in black label covers multiple phenomena that happen to share some surface characteristics. But on dark nights, when I'm half asleep and thinking about Hopkins and his vanishing coin, or Richardson and his disappearing Cadillac, I wonder if there's something more unified happening. Something that exists in the spaces between categories, that's both physical and psychological, both alien and human, both real and imagined in ways that make those distinctions meaningless. The men in black are what happens at boundaries. They appear at the boundary between the known and unknown, between the witnessed and the secret, between the normal and the impossible. Maybe they're boundary phenomena, entities that can only exist at edges and thresholds, that dissolve if you try to bring them fully into the light. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe they're just odd people in dark suits, made strange by fear and expectation, and the distorting lens of memory. Maybe there's a simple explanation I'm missing, something obvious that would make all the pieces fall into place if I could just see it from the right angle. But I haven't found that angle yet, and I'm not sure anyone has, despite decades of research and thousands of pages of theories and analysis. The men in black remain unexplained, resistant to our attempts to categorize them, to fit them into boxes that make sense. Perhaps that's their purpose, to remind us that reality is larger and stranger than our theories can capture, to show us that there are questions without answers, mysteries that won't resolve no matter how carefully we examine them. Or perhaps they have no purpose at all. Perhaps they simply are, existing in whatever way they exist, and all our attempts to understand them say more about us than about them. Rest now. Let the theories drift away like fog in morning sun. You don't need to solve the mystery tonight. You don't need to choose between explanations or resolve contradictions. The men in black exist in uncertainty, and that's where you can leave them, in the space between possible and impossible, where sleep and waking blur together, where questions don't need answers to be real. Section 7, Folklore Echoes. There's a pattern that emerges when you step back from the specific cases, from the individual encounters with pale men in outdated suits. The pattern is old, much older than the 1950s, older than flying saucers and Cold War paranoia. It's a pattern that echoes through folklore and fairy tales, through myths and legends that predate our modern world by centuries. The men in black are not new, or rather, the experience they represent is not new. Humanity has always told stories about visitors who aren't quite human, who appear at thresholds and boundaries, who issue warnings and create unease. We've just dressed them in different costumes across the ages, given them different names, but the essential encounter remains the same. In Irish and Scottish folklore there are stories of the Fae, the fairy folk who could appear as humans but were always wrong in subtle ways. They might have eyes that didn't blink correctly, or skin that seemed too smooth, too perfect. They wore clothes that mimicked human fashion, but were made of materials that didn't exist in the mortal world, fabrics that shimmered or stayed pristine no matter the weather. They spoke human language but with odd cadences, formal phrasings, as though they'd learned the words without understanding the warmth behind them. The Fae would visit people who had seen too much, who had glimpsed the hidden world that existed alongside the everyday. If you saw the fairy mounds, if you witnessed the wild hunt, if you crossed paths with beings you weren't meant to see, you might receive a visit. Not immediately, but soon. 3 days later, or 3 nights, or some other significant interval. The visitors would come to your door, beautiful and terrible, and they would deliver messages wrapped in courtesy and threat. They would tell you to forget, to stop speaking of what you'd seen, to turn your attention back to mortal concerns and leave the hidden world alone. And if you didn't comply, if you continued to speak or investigate, consequences would follow. Not always violent, but always present. You might lose time, find yourself confused about what was real and what was dream. You might find your memory altered, details shifting and changing until you couldn't trust your own recollection of events. The similarities are striking. The visitors who come after the sighting, the warning to remain silent, the sense of being observed by forces beyond human authority, the strange appearance and behaviour that marks them as other. Even the time distortion, the 3-day interval that appears in so many men in black cases, echoes the fairy tale pattern of events happening in threes. I remember reading, though I can't quite place where, about a man in rural Ireland in the 1800s who claimed to have seen lights dancing over a fairy ring. 3 nights later, he received visitors, 2 men in dark clothes, finer than anything the local people wore, made of fabric that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. They spoke to him in his kitchen, asked him questions about what he'd seen, and when they left, he found he couldn't quite remember their faces or what exactly they'd said. Only the warning remained, lodged in his mind like a splinter. Speak no more of this. But maybe I didn't read that. Maybe I constructed it from pieces of different stories, Irish folklore blended with men in black accounts, until they became indistinguishable in my memory. The pattern is so consistent that the individual stories start to merge, forming a composite tale that feels more true than any single incident. In Native American traditions, there are stories of trickster spirits who appear in human form to test people, to deliver messages from the spirit world. They often wear black, sometimes animal skins, but sometimes cloth that seems impossibly fine. They speak in riddles and contradictions, asking questions that have no good answers, issuing warnings that are both clear and obscure. These tricksters appear at liminal times, dawn and dusk, the hours between day and night when the boundaries between worlds are thinnest. They appear at crossroads, at borders, at places where one thing becomes another. And they appear to people who have crossed boundaries themselves, who have ventured too far into knowledge or experience that was meant to remain hidden. The trickster's visit is both a warning and a test. Will you heed the message to turn back? Will you continue forward despite the consequences? Either choice has meaning, either path leads somewhere, but the visitor marks the moment of decision, the point at which innocence ends and responsibility begins. In Japanese folklore, there are the men in black too, though they're called different names. Supernatural beings who dress in dark robes, who appear to people who have witnessed yokai or other spirit phenomena. They come with warnings, with implications of danger, with the suggestion that some knowledge is too heavy for mortal minds to carry. These figures often have pale skin, sometimes described as white as rice paper. Their movements are precise, controlled, as though they're following choreography rather than moving naturally. They speak in formal, archaic language that sounds wrong to modern ears, and they leave behind questions more than answers, a sense of unease that lingers long after they've departed. Across cultures, across centuries, the pattern repeats. Witnesses to impossible things receive visits from beings who are almost but not quite human. These visitors issue warnings, create fear, and then disappear, leaving the witness changed and uncertain. Some researchers believe this points to a consistent phenomenon that has always existed. Not aliens in the modern sense, but something older, something that has been interacting with humanity since before we had the language to describe it properly. We interpret it through our current cultural framework, so in the age of UFOs they appear as men in black associated with flying saucers. In earlier ages they appeared as fairy messengers or spirit visitors, but the underlying reality, if there is an underlying reality, remains constant. Other researchers think the pattern shows that these are cultural constructs, archetypes that emerge naturally from the human psyche when confronted with the unknown. We need a way to process encounters with the inexplicable, so we create visitor narratives. The visitors take the form that makes sense for our time and place, but they're generated internally, psychological defense mechanisms rather than external beings. I find myself drawn to the folklore parallels, perhaps because I grew up with fairy tales, with stories of warnings and boundaries and consequences. When I read about the men in black, I hear echoes of those older stories, the ones told around fires before electricity, before UFOs, before our modern categories of possible and impossible. There's a particular story I remember, or think I remember, about a woman who saw the Fairy Queen's procession passing through her village one midsummer eve. She watched from her window as the beautiful, terrible figures moved through the streets, and she was wise enough to close her eyes before they noticed her watching. But 3 nights later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a man and a woman, both dressed in clothes that seemed expensive and foreign. They asked if they might come in for water, as travellers often did in those times. She invited them in, as custom required. They sat at her table, but they didn't drink the water she offered. Instead, they asked her about what she'd seen 3 nights before. She denied seeing anything, said she'd been asleep, had heard nothing, knew nothing. But the visitors smiled, and their smiles had no warmth in them. They told her she was wise to say so, that forgetting was safer than remembering, that some sights were not meant for mortal eyes, and those who witnessed them anyway would do well to forget quickly and completely. Then they stood and left, and the woman discovered that she couldn't actually remember what she'd seen 3 nights before. The memory was gone, smoothed away as though it had never been there. Only the visit from the strange couple remained, and the knowledge that she'd lost something, though she couldn't say what. That's a fairy tale, of course. Or maybe it's a Men in Black account from before we called them by that name. Or maybe it's something I dreamed or invented, a hybrid story my mind constructed to bridge the gap between folklore and modern paranormal encounters. I can't always distinguish anymore between what I've read and what I've imagined. But the structure is the same: the witnessing, the interval, the visit, the warning, the consequences. This structure appears again and again, in culture after culture, century after century. Either it represents something real and persistent that humanity keeps encountering, or it represents something deep in our collective psyche that keeps expressing itself in similar forms. The Men in Black are the modern inheritors of a very old tradition of threshold guardians, beings who appear at boundaries to warn us not to cross, or to punish us for having crossed already. They're wearing suits now instead of robes or fairy garb, driving cars instead of riding horses or appearing from thin air. But the function remains the same. In medieval European folklore there are accounts of the Black Man, a figure associated with witchcraft and forbidden knowledge. He would appear to those who dabbled in occult matters, offering bargains or issuing warnings. He dressed in black, naturally, and his appearance was unsettling in ways witnesses struggled to articulate. Too pale or too dark. Eyes that reflected light strangely. A voice that seemed to come from somewhere other than his mouth. The Black Man would visit at night, would ask questions about what the witness knew and how they'd learned it. He'd make offers of power or threats of consequences, and then he'd leave, and the witness would be left uncertain about whether the visit had been real or dream, whether they'd truly encountered something, or merely experienced a vivid nightmare brought on by guilt and fear. The parallels are almost too obvious. Change a few details, shift the time period and cultural context, and these could be Men in Black accounts. Or perhaps the Men in Black accounts are simply the latest chapter in a much longer story, a story humanity has been telling itself or experiencing for as long as we've been capable of seeing things we shouldn't see. There's comfort in recognizing the pattern, in seeing that we're not alone in this experience across time. Whatever the Men in Black are, people have been encountering them, or something like them, for centuries. We're part of a long tradition of witnesses, of people who saw too much and received visitors because of it. But there's also something unsettling in that continuity. If this has been happening for so long, why haven't we figured it out? Why do we still not know what these visitors are or where they come from? Are we incapable of understanding, or are we being prevented from understanding? Is our confusion deliberate, maintained by forces that benefit from our ignorance? I think about fairy tale warnings. Don't stray from the path. Don't eat the fairy food. Don't give them your true name. Don't look back. These are instructions encoded in story form, wisdom passed down through generations about how to navigate encounters with the otherworldly. What are the rules for encountering Men in Black? What wisdom are we supposed to derive from these modern fairy tales? Don't report UFO sightings. Don't investigate too deeply. Don't talk about what you've seen. Accept the official explanations. Return to normal life. These seem to be the messages, the warnings embedded in Men in Black encounters. But should we heed them? Or is heeding them exactly what they want, and resistance is the wiser path? In fairy tales, the protagonist often succeeds by breaking the rules, by being clever or brave enough to defy the warnings. But in fairy tales, there's usually a happy ending. In Men in Black accounts, there's rarely resolution, just ongoing unease and unanswered questions. Maybe that's the real difference between folklore and modern paranormal encounters. Folklore has been processed, shaped by countless retellings until it has structure and meaning. The hero's journey leads somewhere. The moral is clear even if the magic isn't. But we're living inside the Men in Black story right now, and we haven't reached the end yet. We don't know if there will be resolution, or just more mystery accumulating indefinitely. The folklore echoes remind us that mystery is not new. Humanity has always lived alongside things we don't understand, forces we can't control, visitors we can't explain. Our ancestors made peace with that uncertainty, built it into their worldview, created stories that acknowledged the unknown without needing to eliminate it. Maybe that's what we need to relearn, how to live with mystery instead of frantically trying to solve it, how to acknowledge that some visitors might always remain unexplained, some warnings might never make complete sense, some boundaries might exist for reasons we can't comprehend. The Men in Black walk the same paths that fairy messengers and spirit guardians walked centuries ago. They knock on doors that have heard supernatural knocking since houses first had doors. They deliver warnings that echo back through time to the earliest human encounters with the numinous and the terrifying, and we, the modern witnesses, the people reading about them late at night while the world sleeps, we're part of that tradition too. Part of the long line of humans who saw something impossible and then tried to make sense of it, tried to warn others, tried to understand what visited us and why. The folklore doesn't give us answers, but it gives us context, continuity, the knowledge that we're not the first to walk this strange path. And somehow, in the quiet of late-night reflection, that's almost comforting. Section 8. Memory and Erasure. One of the most disturbing aspects of Men in Black encounters, more unsettling perhaps than the strange appearances or vanishing cars, is what happens to memory afterward. Witnesses describe forgetting things they should remember. They describe confusion about timelines, about what was said during the encounter, about whether certain events happened in the order they remember, or in some other sequence that makes less sense. Memory becomes unreliable after a Man in Black visits. Not always immediately, but gradually, like a photograph left in sunlight, the details fade and blur until you're left with impressions rather than facts, feelings rather than clear recollections. Dr. Hopkins remembered the pale man, the lipstick, the vanishing coin, but when he tried to recall the exact words spoken, the specific threats made, he found the memories slippery, elusive. He knew he'd been warned. He knew he'd been frightened. But the precise content of the conversation had become hazy, as though he'd experienced it through a fog or underwater. Other witnesses report similar phenomena. They remember the visit happening but can't recall how long it lasted. Was it 15 minutes or an hour? They remember answering questions but can't reconstruct what the questions were. They remember feeling threatened but can't point to specific statements that constituted threats. It's as though the encounter exists in a different kind of time, a different quality of experience that doesn't translate cleanly into normal memory. The emotional content remains, the fear and confusion and sense of wrongness. But the factual details slip away, leaving gaps that the mind tries unsuccessfully to fill. Some witnesses describe missing time around Men in Black encounters. They remember the doorbell ringing, remember opening the door, and then the next clear memory is standing in the living room after the visitors have left with no clear recollection of the intervening conversation. Or they remember sitting at the kitchen table talking to the stranger, and then suddenly it's an hour later and they're alone, with only fragments of memory about what was discussed. This missing time phenomenon is familiar from alien abduction accounts, and it raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between Men in Black and the broader UFO experience. Are they separate phenomena that happen to share some characteristics, or are they different aspects of the same underlying experience, different faces worn by the same mystery? I've read accounts, though the sources blur together in my mind now, of witnesses who tried to take notes during or immediately after Men in Black encounters. They wanted documentation, proof, something solid to hold on to when memory proved unreliable. But the notes, when they reviewed them later, made no sense. The handwriting was wrong, or the words were jumbled, or entire sections were illegible, or the notes would go missing, disappear from places they'd been securely stored, only to reappear weeks later in odd locations with no explanation for how they got there. One witness, a researcher investigating UFO sightings in the southwest, decided to record a Men in Black visit. When the two men in dark suits arrived at his motel room, he had a tape recorder running, hidden but active. The men stayed for 20 minutes, asked their questions, delivered their warnings, and left. When the researcher played back the tape, expecting to have clear evidence of the encounter, he found only static. Not blank tape, but harsh, continuous static that hurt to listen to. As though something had interfered with the recording, corrupted it deliberately, or as though the men existed in a way that recording devices couldn't capture, their voices and presence failing to translate into electromagnetic signals that could be preserved. He tried again with the next visit, because of course they came back. These visitors always come back if you don't comply with their first warning. This time he used a newer recorder, checked it thoroughly beforehand to ensure it was working properly. Same result. Static. The tape captured the sounds of the door opening and closing, captured his own voice asking questions. But where the visitors' responses should have been, there was only that harsh, empty noise. After that, he stopped trying to record them, stopped trying to document them in ways that would convince others. Because what's the point of evidence that erases itself? What's the value of documentation that becomes static or goes missing or reads like nonsense when you try to share it? This is one of the Men in Black's most effective weapons, this assault on memory and documentation. They don't just warn you to stay silent, they make silence inevitable by ensuring you have nothing reliable to share, no evidence that will convince anyone, often not even yourself when enough time has passed and doubt creeps in. Witnesses begin to question their own experiences. Did the visitor really have no eyebrows? Or is that a detail you added later because you'd read about other cases? Was the car really pristine despite being decades old? Or is your memory embellishing, creating drama where there was only mundane strangeness? Did the coin actually vanish? Or did you just not see where the man put it, and your mind filled in impossibility because that's what you expected to see? The questioning becomes corrosive. It eats away at certainty, turns solid experience into doubt. And eventually, many witnesses stop talking about their encounters, not because they've been explicitly threatened or punished, but because they're no longer sure what they experienced, and they're tired of defending their uncertain memories against skepticism, including their own. There are theories about why memory fails around these encounters. The psychological explanation suggests that the experience is so traumatic, so incompatible with normal understanding, that the mind protects itself by suppressing details, creating gaps to avoid confronting the full weight of the impossible. The technological explanation proposes that the Men in Black use some form of memory manipulation device, perhaps electromagnetic in nature, that disrupts the formation or retention of memories. The static on the tapes could be evidence of such technology, interference patterns left behind by whatever equipment they use to cloud witnesses' minds. The supernatural explanation, drawing on the folklore parallels, suggests that these beings simply exist in a way that human consciousness can't fully capture. We're not equipped to remember encounters with the otherworldly in the same way we remember normal events. The details slip away because they were never fully there to begin with, or because they exist in dimensions of experience our brains aren't designed to store. I find myself wondering, late at night when I'm reviewing my notes for this script, whether my own memories are reliable. I've been researching Men in Black cases for weeks now, or is it months? Time has become uncertain. I have all these accounts in my mind, all these stories, but when I try to remember where I read specific details, the sources vanish. Was it Keel who reported that case? Or Vallee? Did I read about the tape recorder incident in a book, or hear about it in a podcast, or am I confusing multiple different incidents into a single composite story? The more I research the Men in Black, the less certain I become about what I actually know. It's as though investigating them creates the same memory problems their victims experience. Maybe that's how they protect themselves, how they remain mysterious. Not through active suppression, but through a kind of contagion, a property that spreads through the very act of studying them, turning clear facts into hazy maybes. There are witnesses who report that Men in Black told them they would forget. Not a threat, just a statement of fact. "You will not remember this conversation," said flatly, emotionlessly, and then proven correct when the witness later tries to recall details and finds only fragments, glimpses, the sense of something important that's now out of reach. How do you fight an enemy that attacks memory itself? How do you resist visitors who can make you uncertain about your own experience? Traditional intimidation you can push back against, can refuse to be silenced by, but this is more insidious. This turns you against yourself, makes you your own censor through doubt and confusion. Some witnesses have tried writing down their experiences immediately, in exhaustive detail, hoping to preserve the memories before they fade. And sometimes this works, to a degree. The written account remains even if the living memory becomes uncertain. But then you have the strange experience of reading your own words and feeling like you're reading about someone else, as though the person who wrote those sentences was a different version of you who had access to memories you no longer possess. I have notes about cases I don't clearly remember researching, pages of details about encounters I can't remember reading about. Did I write these? The handwriting is mine, or appears to be mine, but I have no memory of taking these particular notes, no recollection of the source material they came from. It's unsettling, this feeling that you've done work you can't remember doing, that you've learned things you can no longer access directly. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I've been working on this project too long. reading too many accounts until they all blur together into a single indistinct mass of strangeness. Memory problems are normal when you're tired, when you've been focused on one subject for extended periods. Nothing mysterious about it, just ordinary cognitive fatigue. But the men in black aren't ordinary, and their effects on witnesses aren't ordinary, and I can't shake the feeling that researching them has opened me to those same effects, as though there's a psychic contamination that spreads through the very act of paying too much attention to them. There are witnesses who report that years after their encounter, memories suddenly return. Details they'd completely forgotten resurface without warning, vivid and clear, as though whatever was blocking them has lifted. A smell they hadn't remembered noticing, a phrase the visitor used that suddenly echoes in their mind, the colour of the visitor's eyes, which they could have sworn they never saw because of the sunglasses, but now they remember the glasses came off for just a moment, and the eyes underneath were wrong, completely wrong, in ways they still can't articulate. These recovered memories are both a relief and a new source of anxiety. A relief because they feel like reclaiming something that was stolen, gaining back a piece of your own experience. But anxious because if the memories were hidden, might they be hidden again? And if memories can return, might other memories be lurking, suppressed, waiting to resurface and reveal even more disturbing aspects of the encounter that you've been mercifully spared from knowing? It's one thing to forget. It's another to remember forgetting, to become aware that there are gaps in your memory where something specific used to be. That awareness, that knowledge of absence, can be worse than the original experience. You become haunted not by what you remember, but by what you know you've forgotten. Some witnesses describe a particular feeling they get sometimes, years after their men in black encounter. A sudden, overwhelming conviction that someone is about to knock on their door. They'll be sitting quietly, reading or watching television, and the certainty will wash over them. Any second now there will be a knock and they'll open the door to find a pale figure in a black suit, and this time the warning will be final. But the knock never comes. They wait, tense and afraid, but their door remains quiet. The feeling fades. They convince themselves it was just anxiety, just a stress response triggered by some random neural misfire. But the feeling returns, sometimes months later, sometimes years, that same terrible certainty that the visitors are coming back. Is this recovered memory of trauma, the mind still processing a frightening experience long after it occurred? Or is it precognition, some psychic awareness that another encounter is approaching? Or is it evidence that the men in black are still watching, still present somehow, their attention creating ripples in consciousness that witnesses can feel even without direct contact? I don't know. I don't know anything for certain anymore, and that's the ultimate triumph of the men in black. They don't need to silence everyone. They just need to make everyone, including those of us who research them, uncertain enough that our testimony becomes worthless, our documentation becomes questionable, our certainty becomes qualified with so many caveats and doubts that the truth, whatever it is, remains buried under layers of maybe and possibly, and I think, but I'm not sure. Memory is how we construct our sense of self, our narrative of who we are and what we've experienced. Attack memory and you attack identity itself. The men in black don't just threaten witnesses, they threaten witnesses' ability to be reliable narrators of their own lives, and perhaps that's the most frightening thing of all, not the pale faces or the vanishing cars or the impossible coin tricks. The fear that your own mind will betray you, that you'll become unable to trust your own recollections, that the story of what happened to you will be lost, even to yourself. But here, in the quiet of this late night, I want you to know that your memories are yours. Whatever you remember, however strange or uncertain, it belongs to you. The men in black may create confusion, may cloud details, may make documentation difficult, but your experience is real, even if proving it becomes impossible. Hold on to what you remember. Write it down if you can, but even if you can't, even if the details fade and the certainty wavers, the core of your experience remains. You encountered something. Something encountered you, and that truth persists even when the specifics dissolve into fog. The men in black want you to doubt, but doubt, while uncomfortable, is not the same as erasure. Your memories, uncertain as they may be, still exist. You still exist, and that's something they can't take away, no matter how thoroughly they attack your ability to recall and document. Rest now. Let your memories settle however they will. Tomorrow they may be clearer, or they may remain hazy. Either way, you've survived another day of knowing about the Men in Black, and survival, in this strange territory, is its own kind of victory. Section 9. Cultural Impact. Something strange happened to the Men in Black as they moved from the shadows of UFO research into the broader cultural consciousness. They transformed. They became something different, something safer, something we could laugh about instead of fear. And I'm not entirely sure that transformation was accidental. In 1997, a movie called Men in Black was released, starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. It was a comedy, a summer blockbuster full of special effects and one-liners. The Men in Black in this film were government agents who monitored alien activity on Earth. But they were heroes, protectors, funny and competent, and fundamentally on humanity's side. They wore the black suits and the sunglasses, drove the black cars, but they were cool rather than terrifying, stylish rather than unsettling. The movie was enormously successful. It spawned sequels, animated series, video games, toys, an entire franchise built around the concept of Men in Black, but stripped of everything that made the original phenomenon disturbing. The pale skin became a tan, the stilted speech became snappy dialogue, the aura of menace became swagger and charm. The visitors who made witnesses afraid to speak became heroes who saved the world while cracking jokes. And with that transformation, something was lost, or something was gained, depending on how you look at it. The term Men in Black became associated primarily with the movie franchise. When people heard those words, they thought of Will Smith, not Herbert Hopkins. They thought of alien weapons and neuralizer devices, not vanishing coins and tape recorders that produced only static. The real phenomenon didn't stop. Witnesses still reported encounters with strange visitors in black suits throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, but their accounts had to compete with the cultural weight of the movies, had to overcome the association with fiction and entertainment. How do you convince someone that you had a genuinely disturbing encounter with mysterious visitors when those same words immediately bring to mind a comedy franchise? Some researchers believe this cultural appropriation was deliberate, that the movies were designed, perhaps not by the filmmakers themselves, but by someone who understood the value of controlling narratives, to trivialize the Men in Black phenomenon, to take something genuinely strange and frightening and turn it into harmless entertainment, so that anyone reporting real encounters would be dismissed as confused fans, people who'd watched too many movies and started believing fiction was real. It's a conspiracy theory, of course, the idea that popular culture is weaponized to discredit paranormal phenomena. But it's not an absurd conspiracy theory. We know that intelligence agencies have worked with Hollywood before, that there's a long history of government influence on how certain subjects are portrayed in film and television. And if you wanted to suppress information about genuine Men in Black encounters, turning them into beloved movie characters would be an elegant solution. You don't need to threaten witnesses if you can make their testimony sound like movie plot summaries. I remember when the first Men in Black movie came out, though my memory of that time is less clear than it should be. I was excited, I think, because I'd been reading about the real phenomenon and thought a mainstream movie might bring attention to it. Or maybe I was worried that the movie would do exactly what it did, would bury the truth under layers of fiction until no one could find it anymore. Did I see the movie in theatres? I must have. I remember scenes from it, remember the humour and the special effects. But I can't clearly recall the experience of watching it for the first time, can't place myself in a specific theatre on a specific date. It's as though the movie exists in my memory as something I've always known about rather than something I experienced at a particular moment. But whether the cultural transformation was deliberate or simply organic, the result is the same. The Men in Black became fiction. They entered the realm of entertainment, of things we consume for fun rather than things we investigate seriously. And once something becomes primarily fictional in the public mind, it's nearly impossible to reclaim it as potentially real. The phenomenon didn't help itself either. As Men in Black became more widely discussed in the 90s, more people started reporting encounters, and the quality of reports became more variable. Some were clearly influenced by the movies, describing visitors that had characteristics borrowed from the film rather than the original accounts. Others seemed designed to be sensational, to get attention, adding dramatic elements that didn't match the pattern of earlier encounters. This happens with any phenomenon that becomes popular. Signal gets mixed with noise. Genuine accounts get buried under hoaxes and misidentifications, and people who want their moment of attention. The Men in Black reports from the 90s onward are harder to evaluate than the earlier ones, harder to separate possible genuine encounters from people who'd consumed too much. Men in Black media, and were interpreting normal experiences through that lens. There are researchers who argue that the entire Men in Black phenomenon was always cultural, always a kind of shared mythology that grew out of Cold War anxiety and UFO folklore. They point to how the accounts changed over time, how they reflected contemporary fears and expectations. In the 50s, the Men in Black were linked to government suppression and conformity anxiety. In the 70s, they became more supernatural, more explicitly alien, reflecting the decade's interest in paranormal phenomena. In the 90s, they became mixed up with pop culture, unable to exist independently of the entertainment that had absorbed them. According to this view, there never were real Men in Black. There was always only the story of Men in Black, a narrative that people found useful for expressing their fears about authority, about the unknown, about being silenced or dismissed or erased. The visitors in dark suits were metaphors that some people experienced as literal, psychological constructs that manifested in ways that felt physical. But this explanation, neat as it is, doesn't account for the cases that predate any widespread knowledge of the phenomenon. Albert Bender in 1953, before there was a template, before there was a cultural expectation of what Men in Black should look like or how they should behave. Herbert Hopkins in 1976, describing details that matched Bender's earlier account even though Hopkins claimed no knowledge of that case. The consistency across witnesses who had no contact with each other, and often no familiarity with the broader phenomenon. Unless the cultural narrative is older than we think, embedded in folklore and myth as we discussed earlier, already present in the collective unconscious, waiting to be activated by UFO sightings and social anxiety. Unless the story has always been there, and the 50s didn't create it, but merely gave it a new form, new clothes, a new name for an old visitation pattern. I think about the distance between the movie Men in Black and the phenomena they're supposedly based on. The movie agents are confident, powerful, in control. The real Men in Black, or the reported real Men in Black, are uncanny, unsettling, wrong, in ways that create discomfort rather than admiration. The movie agents want to protect humanity from dangerous truths. The reported Men in Black want to suppress truths that someone has decided humans shouldn't know. It's a complete reversal. The predator becomes the protector. The silencer becomes the hero. The thing that witnesses feared becomes the thing that audiences cheer for. And in that reversal, the original phenomenon becomes harder to discuss seriously, harder to investigate without being dismissed as confused or attention-seeking. There have been other cultural representations too, other ways the Men in Black have appeared in movies, television shows, books, comics. Sometimes they're portrayed as sinister, closer to the original accounts. But even these darker portrayals exist within the framework of fiction, of entertainment, of things we consume and then dismiss when we turn off the screen or close the book. The Men in Black have become domesticated through culture. We've taken something strange and frightening and turned it into something we can sell, something we can merchandise, something children can dress up as for Halloween. And maybe that's how we cope with the genuinely unsettling aspects of our reality. We take them, we fictionalize them, we make them safe enough to live with. Or maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to do. Maybe the cultural absorption of the Men in Black is part of their strategy, whoever they are, whatever they are. Let humans turn you into fiction. Let them laugh at you, celebrate you, buy action figures of you. Because once you're fictional, you're no longer a threat to be taken seriously. You're just entertainment, just another movie monster, just another thing that doesn't really exist outside the realm of make-believe. The witnesses know differently. The people who open their doors to pale figures in outdated suits, who watched coins vanish and cars disappear, who felt their memories slip away like water through cupped hands. They know the Men in Black aren't fiction, or weren't fiction, or exist in some space that makes the distinction between fiction and reality meaningless. But their voices are quieter now, harder to hear over the noise of pop culture references and movie quotes. When someone mentions Men in Black, the automatic association is with entertainment, not investigation. And that association is so strong, so deeply embedded in collective consciousness, that it would take enormous effort to shift it, to reclaim the term for serious research into genuine anomalies. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we need different terms now. new language to describe encounters with mysterious visitors in dark suits, language that hasn't been colonized by Hollywood, that hasn't been turned into jokes and merchandising opportunities. We could call them something else, create new categories that don't carry the weight of cultural contamination. But I suspect the same thing would happen. Any term that gained traction, any phrase that effectively described the phenomenon, would eventually be absorbed by culture, transformed by the entertainment industry, turned into something safe and marketable. It's what we do with everything that frightens us. We domesticate it through fiction until it can't hurt us anymore. Except the real encounters, if they're real, continue regardless of what we call them or how we portray them in movies. The visitors don't care about our cultural frameworks or our entertainment industries. They appear when they appear, deliver their messages, create their effects, and leave. And the witnesses are still left holding experiences they can't easily share, memories they can't fully trust, and now, added to everything else, the burden of fighting against cultural associations that make their accounts sound like movie plots. I wonder sometimes if the witnesses from the 50s and 60s, before the cultural transformation, before the movies and the toys and the jokes, if they had it easier or harder. Easier because their accounts didn't have to compete with Will Smith's charm and Tommy Lee Jones's deadpan. Harder because there was less framework, less language, less community of other witnesses who could say, yes, that happened to me too. But maybe I'm romanticizing the past, projecting onto earlier eras a simplicity they didn't have. Witnesses have probably always struggled to be believed, always faced skepticism and dismissal. The specific cultural obstacles change, but the fundamental isolation of having experienced something others haven't remains constant. The Men in Black, whether as phenomenon or as cultural artifact, have spread far beyond their origins in obscure UFO newsletters. They're everywhere now, recognized worldwide, part of our shared vocabulary. But in becoming universal, they've also become shallow, their original strangeness smoothed away by repetition and commercial use. And I can't help but wonder if that was the point all along. Not to stop people from seeing UFOs or reporting encounters, but to ensure that when they did report, when they did speak about visitors in black suits and impossible experiences, no one would take them seriously. The most effective cover-up isn't silence, it's noise, distraction, cultural saturation with fictional versions that crowd out the possibility of reality. Or maybe I'm seeing conspiracies where there are only accidents of culture, reading intention into what's simply the natural process of how stories spread and transform. Maybe the Men in Black became movies because they're inherently cinematic, visually striking, narratively interesting. Maybe there's no hidden agenda, just the ordinary operation of entertainment industries looking for material to adapt, and audiences looking for thrills that feel safe because they're explicitly labelled as fiction. I don't know. Like everything else about the Men in Black, the truth of their cultural impact remains elusive, open to interpretation, impossible to pin down with certainty. We're left, as always, with questions and theories and the nagging sense that something important is being obscured, whether deliberately or accidentally, by the very act of trying to understand it. But the movies are enjoyable, I should say that. Whatever their effect on serious research, they're fun to watch, cleverly made, entertaining. And maybe we need that. Maybe we need to be able to laugh at the things that frighten us, to transform them into something we can enjoy rather than something that keeps us awake at night, wondering if that knock at the door will ever come. The Men in Black in the movies will save the world. The Men in Black in reported encounters will try to make you forget you saw anything at all. And the Men in Black in our culture will continue to exist in that strange space between those two extremes, neither fully heroic nor fully sinister, but something we've collectively agreed to keep around, in whatever form makes us most comfortable. Section 10. Closing reflections and wind down. We've travelled a long way together tonight, through decades of strange encounters, through theories and folklore, through memory and erasure and cultural transformation. The Men in Black have revealed themselves to us in fragments, in pieces that don't quite fit together into a complete picture. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe they're not meant to be fully understood, only encountered, only acknowledged as part of the larger mystery that surrounds us. I've been thinking about what draws us to stories like this, why we're fascinated by visitors who come in the night with warnings and wrongness. Part of it, I think, is that the Men in Black represent something fundamental about the human condition. We all fear being silenced, being dismissed, being told that our experiences aren't valid or real. We all know what it's like to see something true and have others doubt us. The men in black are that fear-given form. They're the embodiment of invalidation, of erasure, of being told that what you witnessed isn't important or doesn't exist. They come after you've already crossed a threshold, already seen something you can't unsee, and they try to push you back across, try to make you forget or deny or hide what you know. But here's something I've realised over the course of preparing this story for you, something that's become clear as I've sifted through accounts and theories and cultural artefacts. The men in black have never actually succeeded. Not completely, not permanently. Yes, they silence some witnesses. Yes, they create fear and confusion. Yes, they make documentation difficult and memory unreliable. But people still talk. The stories still circulate. Decades after Albert Bender went silent, we're still discussing what happened to him. Years after Herbert Hopkins destroyed his research, we still know about his encounter with the Pale Man and the vanishing coin. The witnesses who were warned to forget have been remembered by the rest of us. The men in black, for all their power and strangeness, cannot fully suppress the human need to communicate, to share experience, to tell stories about what we've seen and felt and endured. They operate in shadow and secrecy, but every shadow creates its own form of visibility. We notice the darkness because we know something is blocking the light. And maybe that's the real lesson here, if there is a lesson in any of this. Not that the men in black exist or don't exist, not that they're aliens or government agents or interdimensional beings or psychological constructs, but that the impulse to silence is always met by the impulse to speak, that witnesses, despite fear and despite doubt, still find ways to share their truths. Some do it publicly, risking ridicule and disbelief. Others do it quietly, in small circles with trusted friends and family. Still others do it through writing that might never be published, through journals and letters and documents that exist only for themselves, as proof that they witnessed what they witnessed, and that it mattered, even if no one else ever knows. The men in black want silence, but silence is temporary. Eventually someone speaks, and then someone else speaks. And gradually, like water wearing away stone, the accumulated weight of testimony creates its own kind of truth, regardless of whether that truth can be proven in conventional ways. I think about the witnesses sometimes, lying in bed on the nights after their encounters. The fear must be overwhelming. The confusion must be paralyzing. But somehow, most of them survive it. They go back to their lives, changed perhaps, more cautious perhaps, but they continue. They don't let the visit destroy them, even when it's clearly designed to create maximum psychological impact. There's courage in that continuation. Quiet courage, the kind that doesn't get medals or recognition, but courage nonetheless, to see something impossible and then receive visitors who make that impossibility even stranger, and to somehow integrate that experience and keep living, keep functioning, keep being human despite having glimpsed something that exists outside human categories. The men in black test us, whether deliberately or simply by their nature. They test our certainty, our memory, our willingness to trust our own perceptions against pressure to dismiss and forget. And while many witnesses fail that test, at least initially, at least in the moment of fear and confusion, many also eventually pass it. They reclaim their experience, they own their truth, however strange it is. I don't know if I would pass that test. I like to think I would, that if pale figures in black suits appeared at my door I would remain calm, document everything, resist their warnings, speak openly about the encounter. But I suspect I'm fooling myself. I suspect that faced with that wrongness, that uncanny presence, that subtle threat, I would comply. I would stay silent. I would doubt myself into invisibility. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe none of us know how we'd respond until we're tested. Maybe courage or compliance aren't choices we make rationally, but reactions that emerge from deeper parts of ourselves, parts we don't have conscious access to until the moment arrives. The good news, if there is good news in this strange territory, is that most of us will never be tested. Most of us will never see a UFO or report one. Most of us will never open our door to find visitors in black suits asking questions that don't quite make sense. We'll live our entire lives without encountering the men in black, without needing to decide whether to speak or stay silent. And that's fine. That's more than fine. There's no virtue in seeking out these encounters, No badge of honor in becoming a witness to things that bring fear and confusion. The people who have had these experiences didn't choose them. The encounters happened to them, often randomly, often without warning. They're not special or chosen. They're just people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. But for those who have encountered the men in black, for those who carry these strange memories and uncertain recollections, I hope this journey we've taken tonight provides some comfort. You're not alone. You're part of a pattern that extends across decades, across cultures, across the boundaries between folklore and modern experience. What happened to you has happened to others. Your confusion and fear and doubt are shared by witnesses throughout history. That doesn't make it easier, necessarily. Knowing others have suffered doesn't reduce your own suffering, but it does create context, community, the sense that you're not isolated in your strangeness. The men in black try to isolate witnesses, but the testimony of those witnesses, preserved and shared, creates connection instead of isolation. You're part of something larger, whether you want it to be or not. As we come to the end of this story, I want to acknowledge what we haven't resolved. We haven't determined what the men in black really are. We haven't explained the vanishing cars or the impossible coin tricks. We haven't discovered why memory fails around these encounters, or why documentation becomes unreliable. We haven't solved the mystery. But maybe mysteries don't need solving. Maybe some questions are more valuable than any answer could be. The men in black sit at the intersection of so many uncertainties, so many boundaries between possible and impossible, known and unknown, real and unreal. They remind us that reality is more complex than our categories suggest, that there are experiences that resist explanation without being dismissible. We live in an age that wants everything explained, everything categorized, everything understood. But the men in black resist that impulse. They remain stubbornly mysterious, stubbornly strange, stubbornly outside the boundaries of comfortable knowledge, and perhaps that's their gift to us, if we can see it that way. They preserve mystery in a world that wants to eliminate it. They remind us that we don't know everything, can't explain everything, can't control everything. That's frightening. But it's also, in a strange way, liberating. If reality includes things like the men in black, things that don't fit our models and don't follow our rules, then reality is bigger and stranger and more interesting than we thought. And we're smaller, more limited, more humble than we like to imagine. But that smallness isn't a flaw. It's just an accurate assessment of our place in a universe that's far more mysterious than we can comprehend. The night is very deep now. You've been listening for a long time, following these strange threads as they wind through decades and continents, and the blurry spaces between memory and dream. Your eyes are heavy, or they should be. Your breathing has slowed, or it will soon. The edges of consciousness are softening, and sleep is waiting just beyond the threshold. If you hear a knock tonight, you don't have to answer. It can wait until morning. It can wait until never. You're safe in the darkness, safe in your bed, safe in the ordinary world where most nights pass without visitors, where most doors remain closed against the strange and the impossible. The men in black are out there, somewhere perhaps. Or they're not. Or they're something in between, existing in that liminal space that's neither fully here nor fully absent. But they're not your concern tonight. Tonight is for rest, for sleep, for letting go of questions that have no immediate answers. Let the stories settle into whatever part of your mind stores strange things. Let them rest alongside fairy tales and legends and all the other accounts of mysterious visitors and threshold encounters that humanity has collected over centuries. The men in black will still be mysterious tomorrow. The witnesses will still carry their uncertain memories tomorrow. The questions will still lack definitive answers tomorrow. But tonight you can set it all down. You can close your eyes and let sleep take you wherever sleep takes you, trusting that the morning will come and the ordinary world will still be there, solid and familiar and comprehensible in all the ways that comfort us. The men in black visit witnesses, not listeners. You've only heard about them, only thought about them, only wondered about them. That's safe. That's distant enough. You haven't seen anything you shouldn't see. You haven't crossed any boundaries that might draw their attention. You're just someone who likes strange stories, who finds mystery interesting, who can contemplate the impossible from the comfortable distance of narration. And if years from now you do happen to see something in the sky that doesn't make sense, some light or craft or phenomenon that defies explanation, you'll know what might follow. You'll know about the pattern, about the visits, about the pale figures in dark suits who might appear at your door 3 days later. but knowing doesn't mean it will happen. Most witnesses don't receive visits. Most sightings don't result in men in black encounters. The probability is in your favour. The ordinary is more likely than the extraordinary. Sleep easy in that knowledge. And if the improbable does occur, if you do find yourself answering your door to strangers in black suits who know things they shouldn't know, who behave in ways that create unease, who deliver warnings wrapped in wrongness, remember the other witnesses. Remember that you're part of a pattern, part of a history, part of a community of people who have faced this strangeness and survived it. Remember that silence is temporary, that truth persists, that experience, however strange and uncertain, belongs to you and cannot be fully erased no matter how thoroughly it's attacked. But that's for a future that will probably never come. Tonight is just tonight, and tonight is for sleep. The men in black, whoever and whatever they are, can wait. Everything can wait. Let yourself drift now. Let the stories fade into the background static of consciousness settling into rest. You're safe. You're here. You're just yourself in your bed in the dark, and that's enough. Thank you for joining me tonight on Sleepy Side Stories. Thank you for walking with me through this strange landscape of visitors and vanishing cars, of memory and mystery, of fear and folklore. I hope you found something here worth carrying forward, some perspective or insight, or simply the comfort of knowing you're not alone in wondering about the unexplained. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and if you hear a knock in the night, know that it's probably just the house settling, just the wind, just the ordinary sounds that fill the darkness between sunset and dawn. Probably. The men in black are someone else's concern. Tonight, you have only yourself to concern you. And yourself knows how to sleep, knows how to let go, knows how to surrender to the quiet and the dark and the peaceful nothing of rest. So rest now. We're done with stories for tonight. We've said all there is to say about visitors in black suits and the witnesses who open their doors. The mystery remains, as it always has, as it always will, and that's okay. Mystery makes good company for sleep. It asks nothing from you. It simply exists quietly, in the background of your settling thoughts. Let it exist there. Let everything exist without your attention, without your concern, without your consciousness needed to hold it in place. You can let go now. Everything will still be here in the morning. Everything except, perhaps, the clear memory of these stories. But that's all right too. Forgetting is natural. Forgetting is part of sleep, part of rest, part of being human, in a world that contains more strangeness than we can carry. So forget if you need to, or remember if you can. Either way, sleep will come. It always does. Good night.